Title 4 Crimes Against Public Interest, Chapter 1 Forgeries, Section 1 Forging the seal of the Government of the Philippine Islands, the signature or stamp of the Chief Executive. Article 161 Counterfeiting the Great Seal of the Government of the Philippine Islands. The penalty of reclusion temporal shall be imposed upon any person who shall forge the Great Seal of the Government of the Philippine Islands or the signature or stamp of the Chief Executive. 162. Using forged signature or counterfeit seal or stamps. The penalty of prison mayor shall be imposed upon any person who shall knowingly make use of the counterfeit seal or forged signature or stamp mentioned in the preceding article. 163. Making and importing and uttering false coins. Any person who makes, imports, or utters false coins in connivance with counterfeiters or importers shall suffer 1. Prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods, and a fine not to exceed 400,000 pesos if the counterfeited coins be any of the coinage of the Philippines. 2. Prison correctional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos if the counterfeited coin be currency of a foreign country. 164. Mutilation of coins. The penalty of prison correctional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 400,000 pesos shall be imposed upon any person who shall mutilate coins of the legal currency of the Philippines, or import or utter mutilated current coins, or in connivance with mutilators or importers. 165. Selling of false or mutilated coin without connivance. Any person who knowingly, although without the connivance mentioned in the preceding articles, shall possess false or mutilated coin with intent to utter the same, or shall actually utter such coin, shall suffer a penalty lower by 1 degree than that prescribed in said articles. Section 3. Forging treasury or banknotes, obligations, and securities. Article 166. Forging treasury or banknotes or other documents payable to bearer. The forging or falsification of treasury or banknotes or certificates or other obligations and securities payable to bearer, and the importation and uttering in connivance with forgers or importers of such false or forged obligations or notes shall be punished as follows. 1. By reclusion temporal in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 2 million pesos if the document which has been falsified, counterfeited, or altered is an obligation or security of the Philippines. The words obligation or security of the Philippines shall mean all bonds, certificates of indebtedness, national banknotes, coupons, Philippine notes, treasury notes, fractional notes, certificates of deposit, bills, checks, or drafts for money, drawn by or upon authorized officers of the Philippines and other representatives of value of whatever denomination, which have been or may be issued under any act of Congress. 2. By prison mayor in its maximum period, and a fine not to exceed 1 million pesos if the falsified or altered document is a circulating note issued by any banking association duly authorized by law to issue the same. 3. By prison mayor in its medium period, and a fine not to exceed 1 million pesos if the falsified or counterfeited document was issued by a foreign government. 4. By prison mayor in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 400,000 pesos when the forged or altered document is a circulating note or bill issued by a foreign bank duly authorized therefor. 167. Counterfeiting, importing, and uttering instruments not payable to bearer. Any person who shall forge, import, or utter in connivance with the forgers or importers any instrument payable to order or other document of credit not payable to bearer shall suffer the penalties of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods, and a fine not exceeding 1,200,000 pesos. 1,200,000 pesos. 168. Illegal possession and use of false treasury or banknotes and other instruments of credit. Unless the act be one of those coming under the provisions of any of the preceding articles, any person who shall knowingly use or have in his possession, with intent to use, any of the false or falsified instruments referred to in this section shall suffer the penalty next lower in degree than that prescribed in said articles. 169. How forgery is committed. The forgery referred to in this section may be committed by any of the following means. 1. By giving to a treasury or banknote or any instrument payable to bearer, or to order mentioned therein, the appearance of a true and genuine document. 2. By erasing, substituting, counterfeiting, or altering by any means the figures, letters, words, or signs contained therein. Section 4. Falsification of legislative, public, commercial, and private documents and wireless, telegraph, and telephone messages. 170. Falsification of legislative documents. The penalty of prison correctional in its maximum period and a fine not exceeding 1,200,000 pesos, 200,000 pesos, shall be imposed upon any person who, without proper authority, therefore, alters any bill, resolution, or ordinance enacted or approved pending approval by either House of Congress or any provincial board or municipal council. 171. Falsification by public officer, employee or notary or ecclesiastic minister. The penalty of prison mayor and fine not to exceed 1,000,000 pesos shall be imposed upon any public officer, employee or notary who, taking advantage of his official position, shall falsify a document by committing any of the following acts. 1. Counterfeiting or imitating any handwriting, signature, or rubric. 2. Causing it to appear that persons have participated in any act or proceeding when they did not in fact so participate. 3. Attributing to persons who have participated in an act or proceeding statements other than those in fact made by them. 4. Making untruthful statements in the narration of facts. 5. Altering true dates. 6. Making any alteration or intercalation in a genuine document which changes its meaning. 7. Issuing in an authenticated form a document purporting to be a copy of an original document when no such original exists, or including in such a copy a statement contrary to or different from that of the genuine original. Or 8. Intercalating any instrument or note relative to the issuance thereof in a protocol, registry, or official book. The same penalty shall be imposed upon any ecclesiastical minister who shall commit any of the offences enumerated in the preceding paragraphs of this article with respect to any record or document of such character that its falsification may affect the civil status of persons. 172. Falsification by private individual and use of falsified documents. The penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods and a fine of not more than 1,000,000 pesos shall be imposed upon 1. Any private individual who shall commit any of the falsifications enumerated in the next preceding article in any public or official document or letter of exchange or any kind of commercial document. 2. Any person who, to the damage of a third party or with intent to cause such damage, shall in any private document commit any of the acts of falsification enumerated in the next preceding article. And 3. Any person who shall knowingly introduce in evidence in any judicial proceeding or to the damage of another, or who, with the intent to cause such damage, shall use any of the false documents embraced in the next preceding article or in any of the foregoing subdivisions of this article, shall be punished by the penalty next lower in degree. 173. Falsification of wireless, cable, telegraph, and telephone messages and use of said falsified messages. The penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods shall be imposed upon any officer or employee of the government or any private corporation or concern engaged in the service of sending or receiving wireless, cable, or telephone messages, who utters a fictitious wireless, telegraph, or telephone message of any system or falsifies the same. Any person who shall use such falsified dispatch to the prejudice of a third party or with the intent to cause such prejudice shall suffer the penalty next lower in degree. Section 5. Falsification of medical certificates, certificates of merit or service, and the like. 174. False medical certificates, false certificates of merits or service. The penalties of arresto mayor in its maximum period, to prisión correccional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos shall be imposed upon 1. Any physician or surgeon who, in connection with the practice of his profession, shall issue a false certificate, and 2. Any public officer who shall issue a false certificate of merit of service, conduct, or similar circumstances. The penalty of arresto mayor shall be imposed upon any private person who shall falsify a certificate falling within the classes mentioned in the two preceding subdivisions. 175. Using false certificates. The penalty of arresto menor shall be imposed upon anyone who shall knowingly use any of the false certificates mentioned in the next preceding articles. Section 6. Manufacturing, importing, and possession of instruments or implements intended for the commission of falsification. 176. Manufacturing and possession of instruments or implements for falsification. The penalty of prison correctional in its medium and maximum periods and a fine not to exceed 1 million pesos shall be imposed upon any person who shall make or introduce into the Philippines any stamps, dies, marks, or other instruments or implements intended to be used in the commission of the offenses of counterfeiting or falsification mentioned in the preceding sections of this chapter. Any person who, with the intention of using them, shall have in his possession any of the instruments or implements mentioned in the preceding paragraphs shall suffer the penalty next lower in degree than that provided therein. Chapter 2. Other falsities. Section 1. Usurpation of authority, rank, title, and improper use of names, uniforms, and insignia. Article 177. Usurpation of authority or official functions. Any person who shall knowingly and falsely represent himself to be an officer, agent, or representative of any department or agency of the Philippine government or of any foreign government, or who, under pretense of official position, shall perform any act pertaining to any person in authority or public officer of the Philippine government or any foreign government or any agency thereof without being lawfully entitled to do so, shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum and medium periods. 178. Using fictitious name and concealing true name. The penalty of arresto mayor and a fine not to exceed 100,000 pesos shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly use a fictitious name for the purpose of concealing a crime, evading the execution of a judgment, or causing damage. Any person who conceals his true name and other personal circumstances shall be punished by arresto menor or a fine not to exceed 40,000 pesos. 179. Illegal use of uniforms or insignia. The penalty of arresto mayor shall be imposed upon any person who shall publicly and improperly make use of insignia, uniforms, or dress pertaining to an office not held by such person or to a class of persons of which he is not a member. Section 2. False testimony. 180. False testimony against a defendant. Any person who shall give false testimony against a defendant in any criminal case shall suffer 1. The penalty of reclusion temporal if the defendant in said case shall have been sentenced to death. 2. The penalty of prison mayor if the defendant shall have been sentenced to reclusion temporal or reclusion perpetua. 3. The penalty of prison correctional if the defendant shall have been sentenced to any other afflictive penalty. And 4. The penalty of arresto mayor if the defendant shall have been sentenced to a correctional penalty or a fine or shall have been acquitted. In cases provided in subdivisions 3 and 4 of this article, the offender shall further suffer a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos. 181. False testimony favorable to the defendant. Any person who shall give a false testimony in favor of the defendant in a criminal case shall suffer the penalties of arresto mayor in its maximum period, to prison correctional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos if the prosecution is for a felony punishable by an afflictive penalty, and the penalty of arresto mayor in any other case. 182. False testimony in civil cases. Any person found guilty of false testimony in a civil case shall suffer the penalty of prison correctional in its minimum period and a fine not to exceed 1,200,000 pesos if the amount in controversy shall exceed 1,000,000 pesos, and the penalty of arresto mayor in its maximum period, to prisión correccional in its minimum period, and a fine not to exceed 200,000 pesos if the amount in controversy shall not exceed said amount or cannot be estimated. 183. False testimony in other cases and perjury in solemn affirmation. The penalty of arresto mayor in its maximum period, to prisión correccional in its minimum period, shall be imposed upon any person who, knowingly make untruthful statements and not being included in the provisions of the next preceding articles, shall testify under oath or make an affidavit or upon any material matter before a competent person authorized to administer an oath in cases in which the law so requires. Any person who, in case of a solemn affirmation made in lieu of an oath, shall commit any of the falsehoods mentioned made in this and the three preceding articles of this section, shall suffer the respective penalties provided therein. 184. Offering false testimony in evidence. Any person who shall knowingly offer in evidence a false witness or testimony in any judicial or official proceeding shall be punished as guilty of false testimony and shall suffer the respective penalties provided in this section. Chapter 3. Frauds. Section 1. Machinations, Monopolies, and Combinations. 185. Machinations in public auctions. Any person who shall solicit any gift or promise as a consideration for refraining from taking part in any public auction, and any person who shall attempt to cause bidders to stay away from an auction by threats, gifts, promises, or any other artifice with intent to cause the reduction of the price of the thing auctioned, shall suffer the penalty of prisión correccional in its minimum period and a fine ranging from 10 to 50% of the value of the thing auctioned. 186. Monopolies and combinations in restraint of trade. The penalty of prisión correccional in its minimum period, or a fine ranging from 200 to 6,000 pesos, or both, shall be imposed upon 1. Any person who shall enter into any contract or agreement, or shall take part in any conspiracy or combination in the form of a trust or otherwise, in restraint of trade or commerce, or to prevent by artificial means of free competition in the market. 2. Any person who shall monopolize any merchandise or object of trade or commerce, or to prevent by artificial means free competition in the market. 2. Any person who shall monopolize any merchandise or object of trade or commerce, or shall combine with any other person or persons to monopolize said merchandise or object in order to alter the price thereof by spreading false rumors or making use of any artifice to restrain free competition in the market. 3. Any person who, being a manufacturer, producer, or processor of any merchandise or object of commerce, or an importer of any merchandise or object of commerce from any foreign country, either as principal or agent, wholesaler, or retailer, shall combine, conspire, or agree in any manner with any person likewise engaged in the manufacture, production, processing, assembling, or importation of such merchandise or object of commerce, or with any other persons not so similarly engaged, for the purpose of making transactions prejudicial to lawful commerce, or of increasing the market price in any part of the Philippines of any such merchandise or object of commerce manufactured, produced, processed, assembled in, or imported into the Philippines, or of any article in the manufacture of which such manufactured, produced, processed, or imported merchandise or object of commerce is used. If the offense mentioned in this article affects any food substance, motor fuel or lubricants, or other articles of prime necessity, the penalty shall be that of prisión mayor in its maximum and medium periods, it being sufficient for the imposition thereof that the initial steps have been taken toward carrying out the purposes of the combination. Any property possessed under any contract or by any combination mentioned in the preceding paragraphs, and being the subject thereof, shall be forfeited to the Government of the Philippines whenever any of the offenses described above is committed by a corporation or association The President and each one of its agents or representatives in the Philippines, in case of a foreign corporation or association, who shall have knowingly permitted or failed to prevent the commission of such offense, shall be held liable as principals thereof. Section 2. Frauds in Commerce and Industry. Article 187. Importation and disposition of falsely marked articles or merchandise made of gold, silver, or other precious metals or their alloys. The penalty of prison correctional or a fine ranging from 40,000 pesos to 200,000 pesos or both shall be imposed upon any person who shall knowingly import or sell or dispose of any article or merchandise made of gold, silver, or other precious metals or their alloys with stamps, brands, or marks which fail to indicate the actual fineness or quality of said metals or alloys. Any stamp, brand, label, or mark shall be deemed to fail to indicate the actual fineness of the article on which it is engraved, printed, stamped, labeled, or attached, when the test of the article shows that the quality or fineness thereof is less by more than 1/2 carat if made of gold and less by more than 4/1000 if made of silver than what is known by said stamp, brand, label, or mark. But in case of watch cases and flatware made of gold, the actual fineness of such gold shall not be less by more than 3/1000 than the fineness indicated by said stamp, brand, label, or mark.